Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 273 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. How did Americans learn to establish philanthropic institutions? United States history doesn't often celebrate people who teach us how to found organizations, but founding public institutions is really important and vital work. If you think about it, public institutions are critical to vibrant life in American communities. So today, we're going to learn about the life and work of Dr. David Hosack, who not only helped further the field of medicine in the early United States with all of his research into the medicinal uses of plants. Hosack also helped found or co-found more than a dozen different philanthropic organizations in early New York City. Now, to help us explore the life and work of David Hosack, we'll be joined by Victoria Johnson, an associate professor of urban policy and planning at Hunter College in New York City, and the author of American Eden, David Hosack, Botany, and Medicine in the Garden of the Early Republic. Now, as Victoria introduces us to David Hosack, she reveals who David Hosack was and information about his training as a medical doctor, why Hosack worked to build a botanical garden in New York City, which was the first of its kind in the United States, and how David Hosack's personal relationships with the likes of DeWitt Clinton, Alexander Hamilton, and Aaron Burr helped him establish philanthropic institutions like the Elgin Botanical Garden. But first, did you know that Ben Franklin's World is now experimenting with a virtual reading group? It's true. Listeners like you have been helping to create a virtual reading group for early American history in the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook. The community is free and easy to join. Just visit benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. The virtual reading group is always accepting new members, and it is definitely not too late to join us for our weekly discussion questions or our Facebook Live discussion meetings. So I hope you'll visit benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook and join the fun. Okay. Are you ready to explore the life of Dr. David Hosack and his work to establish philanthropic institutions like the first botanical garden in the United States? Let's go meet our expert guide. Joining us is an associate professor of urban policy and planning at Hunter College in New York City. Her research and teaching interests explore the history of philanthropy, nonprofits in New York City. She's the author of 2 books, How the Royal Paris Opera Survived the End of the Old Regime, and, most recently, American Eden, David Hosack, Botany and Medicine in the Garden of the Early Republic, which was a finalist for several prestigious awards, including the 2019 Pulitzer Prize in History and the 2018 National Book Award in Nonfiction. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Victoria Johnson.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, we're thrilled to have you, so thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations on all the success you're having with American Eden.
Thank you. It's been really exciting.
Now, American Eden is a biography of David Hosack, who was a botanist, doctor, and the attending physician at the famous duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Victoria, could you tell us a bit more about Hosack and what prompted you to write a biography about him?
Well, David Hosack was somebody most of us had not heard of, including me, and I came across his name in a book about the founding of the New York Botanical Garden, which was founded in the Gilded Age in New York City. And I have a strong interest in the history of philanthropic and cultural and scientific institutions. And I was reading a book about the founding of the New York Botanical Garden, and it mentioned this man who had founded a garden almost 100 years earlier at the heart of Manhattan. His name was David Hosack, and I was intrigued by the fact that the first public botanical garden had been founded in the early Republic. I had never heard of it, and I'd never heard of the man who founded it. And today, this is what really grabbed me, the land is home to one of the most iconic urban spaces in the world, Rockefeller Center. And that contrast absolutely enchanted and intrigued me, and I was a goner for the next 8 years of research.
Yeah. Wow, that is really quite the contrast when you think about it. Because you think of a garden and it's meant to be in this open space where you can kind of walk around and there's lots of greenery. And then you have Rockefeller Center, which has an ice rink, and it's really in one of the most urban areas of New York City. It's really not a location we would think of with a garden.
Yeah, I grew up going to New York City a lot. My father's a retired professor of urban planning who's a historian of New York City. So I grew up with maps of New York around the house. And yet I had never heard this past history of Rockefeller Center. A lot of us think of Rockefeller Center as kind of old in its way. You know, we're so good in New York at tearing things down and building the new. And Rockefeller Center feels like a throwback to an earlier age of building in New York City. And the idea that this land had been covered with mountain laurel and viburnum and violets and grand old oak trees, that just grabbed me.
Now, before we take a deep dive into David Hosack's life and explore the origins of what sounds like this amazing garden in the center of Manhattan, could you tell us how you approached your biography? Because we have explored the genre and purpose of biography in our Doing History biography series, and I think it would be really interesting for us to hear about your specific approach. So, would you tell us about the different historical sources you looked at and had access to, and whether you faced any specific challenges in trying to document and trace Hosack's life?
Yeah, well, I started thinking I was writing a history of this organization, the first public botanical garden in the United States. My previous book, which you alluded to, was about the Paris Opera, its history of relations to the French state over 120 years. I'm trained as an organizational sociologist as well as a historical sociologist. And I thought I was doing another book like that. And it became clear to me as I studied David Hosack, the founder of this organization, that he merited having his story told completely, finally, for the first time. And he was so accomplished and so famous that I thought he deserved his own biography, but I'd never written a biography, of course. And his papers, he was one of these kind of classic early Republic polymaths. Yet because his fame didn't last past his lifetime, his papers hadn't been collected. You know, with Hamilton, you can get the 26 volumes of his papers and put them on your shelf and consult them. And with Hosack, there was no such critical edition because he wasn't a well-known politician. So I ended up going to about 30 different archives in the US and Great Britain, and to some extent in continental Europe, on the trail of this man. And he was terribly prolific in many, many fields in writing. And so his papers were scattered everywhere. And that was the biggest challenge. And it was also the most fun. There's a lot of people listening to this who are going to understand and know that feeling of the joy of historical sleuthing through the archives. And that was fabulous. It took a long time, but it was totally joyful.
So as you sleuthed and hunted down all of Hosack's papers in the US and Europe, what exactly did you find? What did Hosack's papers reveal to you about his personal and professional life?
Yeah, he was the son of a fairly prosperous merchant in New York City, an importer. And his father had come from Scotland in the French and Indian War to Canada and then ended up settling in New York City, where Hosack was born. Hosack grew up fairly comfortable, and he grew up during the British occupation of Manhattan. And I think because of this experience, he became very interested in becoming a doctor. And he studied at Columbia College, of course, recently renamed. It had been King's College. And then went to get advanced training in Philadelphia with the great physician Benjamin Rush, who had studied in Edinburgh, which was then the cutting edge medical faculty in the world. So Hosack followed suit and he went and studied in Edinburgh. And he also said later in a journal entry, he said that although Americans were very proud of their new institutions, they liked their doctors to come equipped with European credentials. And so I think he found that it would be better for his new medical practice to have British training. So he went over and then he came back and set up his medical practice and had a very, very successful career as a doctor and as a professor himself at Columbia. and did many, many other things, which I think we'll talk about in the course of our discussion.
Why do you think Americans preferred their doctors to have European training and European credentials? Because Hosack really wasn't the first American physician who went abroad to Scotland or London or the Netherlands to seek a medical education.
I think there was a pride in the young nation and a kind of concern that when it came to life and death issues, that millennia of experience in the old world might prove useful in keeping people alive to establish the young nation more securely. Mortality was everywhere and people were succumbing left and right to typhus and yellow fever and scarlet fever and everything else. And I think people just trusted that older tradition of medical education and the credentials. I think, we all still trust credentials today.
Was it because Europeans had more experiences or perhaps different medicines than Americans had to treat some of those diseases that really gave Americans more confidence in a European training than an American medical training?
Yes. And in some cases that actually did translate into success. I think some of it was simply the hope that more experience would prove more helpful medically. But of course, mortality rates were high in Britain as well, especially in childbirth, which became one of Hosack's own specialties, obstetrics. And there was a lack of, especially in Hosack's generation, there was a lack of willingness to really trust Native American medicine. The previous generation, the William Bartram, those botanists were much more acknowledging and trusting of native medicines. And in Hosack's generation, I believe the post-revolutionary generation was very concerned to sort of establish its connections to the old world and the experience and techniques of old world medicine, and not to be seen to be relying on the medicine of what the Europeans would call savages. And the young nation was criticized for relying in its science on the insights of so-called savages. And I think Hosack's generation was very, very sensitive to that. There's another aspect to Hosack's training in Europe, in Britain, which is genuinely advanced compared to the United States. And that was in London. Dissection and anatomy was much more advanced because corpse dissection was more widely accepted by the late 18th century than it was in the United States. And that, of course, was critical to understanding what was going on beneath the skin. So Hosack got much better training in anatomy, and he loved it when he was in Edinburgh and London.
Yeah. Could you tell us a bit more about Hosack's medical training while he was abroad? Because it seems that he didn't just study anatomy, but that he also studied the field of botany and the different medicinal purposes that plants had, too.
Yeah, he went to Scotland, as I said, to follow in Russia's footsteps and study medicine. And he enrolled at the medical faculty in Edinburgh and studied anatomy, chemistry. He shadowed the doctors in the clinics and the hospitals. He didn't go to study botany. He wasn't interested in botany. And suddenly he found himself walking with a professor of his. It was his professor of midwifery who, bizarrely, through a coincidence, was named Alexander Hamilton. And his professor took him to a botanical garden with some of the other students. And Hosack suddenly realized that he was the classic uncultivated American. He didn't know what they were talking about when they walked around conversant in medicinal botany. And this is an age when most of the medicines known to doctors, both in the US and in Europe, came from the plant world. And he had been exposed to medicinal plants in his American medical studies, but I think he thought of them as supplies you kind of bought from the apothecary shop, which I think of as a classic New York kind of behavior. You go down to the shop and buy what you need. And it was in Britain that he got exposed to botanical gardens, and he realized that botanical gardens served as classrooms, pharmacies, textbooks, encyclopedias, all rolled into one for European medical professors and medical students. And he caught fire. He fell in love with this field, medical botany.
So how did Hosack make up for the fact that he felt so incredibly behind and uncultured when it came to the study of botany?
He stayed a second year in Britain. He moved to London, which was the capital of British botany, probably on the recommendation of Edinburgh professors. He went to study with a man in London named William Curtis, who was the greatest practical botanist in Britain, an accomplished Linnaean botanist and a medical botanist. Curtis had a botanical garden that he had founded in the neighborhood of Brompton, and Hosack studied there daily for a whole summer and went on botanizing courses with Curtis out in the wilds around London and learned how to identify plants in the wild, how to press specimens to save them for later consulting and teaching. He learned what parts of the different plants had medicinal uses. He learned how to begin to try to move forward medical knowledge of plants, how to conduct new research. This was a very experimental time when people really didn't know much about what it was about a particular plant chemically that made it effective against a given illness. And Hosack saw this as a kind of unknown and exciting terrain to rush into and not only make his name, but to help his fellow citizens when he came back to the United States. So he studied with Curtis, and he also in London studied in the greatest botanical collections in the world at the time of the Linnaean Society of London, where the collections of the late, great Carl Linnaeus had been assembled and were available for study. And these are the plants that had given us the type species, so the actual dried plant that Linnaeus consulted and said, this is such and such a plant. This is the type on which I'm basing it. And so Hosack was able to consult these original specimens. And so he was studying in the capital of Western botany for a full year. And he ended up in Britain for 2 years. And when he got back to the United States in the summer of 1794, he was almost inadvertently one of the best trained botanists in the United States.
Yes, I'm curious about Hosack's return to New York City because, as we said, he was a native-born New Yorker. He went to Edinburgh for medical training, spent a second year in London to study botany and the medicinal purposes of plants, and then he makes his way back to New York in 1794. What was it like for Hosack to then, after 2 years abroad, come back to New York City in 1794?
Hosack came back from these great cities filled with museums and hospitals, and he came back and he saw a tiny town, the kind of backward town, New York, in the toe of Manhattan Island with pigs running through the streets. And he saw a city in need of civic institutions. And he had spent 2 years touring them and studying in them. And he began to dream of founding some of these civic institutions. And that's what he devoted the rest of his life to. And the array of institutions he was involved in founding or co-founding is absolutely astonishing. And when I began to see, it wasn't just the Botanic Garden that he founded in 1801, it was one institution after another that he either organized or helped organize. There was over a dozen of New York's critical institutions in the arts and sciences. And he began with his botanical garden. And by the end of studying him, I felt that he had helped, with his peers, people like DeWitt Clinton, his best friend, he had helped put New York on the map culturally and scientifically in an age when, of course, Philadelphia was the crown jewel of the United States. And even people like Charles Wilson Peale, the sort of grand old men of Philadelphia arts and sciences, told Hosack personally, New York has now outstripped Philadelphia because of your efforts.
So what were some of the highlights of the specific cultural and scientific institutions that Hosack either founded or co-founded in New York City? And how did he seem to balance all of this philanthropic work with his actual practice of medicine?
I can't answer the second question because it baffles me. He was so energetic and he was so productive, and it kind of was exhausting just studying the man, let alone being him. He founded or co-founded, I'm going to give you the list of organizations that I know for a fact that he was involved in. And of course, other people were involved in most of these. But he founded or co-founded the Botanical Garden, the city's first scientific museum of natural history, the city's first art museum, its first obstetrics hospital, which was really his institution. He really cared about that tremendously. The city's first subsidized pharmacy for the poor to protect the poor from being preyed upon by quacks who were selling patent medicines that weren't effective or were even fatal. The city's first mental hospital, its first horticultural society, one of its literary societies, the city's first public schools with DeWitt Clinton and others, the city's first school for the deaf, and the list goes on. It's really extraordinary. And he somehow did this while publishing endlessly on medical topics. He founded the United States' second medical journal and edited that and published in that. He corresponded with doctors and botanists and sort of lay people around the world about medical and botanical topics. He collected and he patronized, once he had the funds to do it, he was a patron of the Hudson River School of Painters. He was a patron of writers. He taught at Columbia. He co-founded 2 other medical schools, and then he had an enormous family and a very vibrant medical practice. And he also taught students in his private clinic.
Wow, that really is quite the list. Now, you mentioned that Hosack's chief contribution was his founding of the first botanical garden in 1801. Could you tell us what prompted Hosack to create this botanical garden?
Yes, this was his baby. This was the love of his life, of the institutions. He came back from Britain on fire with this idea that the largely unexplored continent must be blanketed in unstudied medicinal plants, unknown plants, plants known to native peoples, but not to the citizens of the United States, plants that might replace hard to import or impossible to grow non-native plants. And I'm just going to point out here that the term of art among botanists for non-native plants is exotic plants. So when I talk about exotic species, I mean that in the botanical sense, not in any other sense, in a cultural sense. So he was very interested in trying to find chemical analogs in native species, analogs to exotic species, known medicinal plants, such as Peruvian bark, which came from the Andes and was impossible to grow in the United States. He founded this garden. Well, first at Columbia, he came back and he started teaching, and he told his students that the United States, of course, deserved doctors just as knowledgeable and skilled as Europe's, but he found it so frustrating, and he told them this in his lectures, that they had no botanical garden to study plants in. It wasn't good enough to teach students out of books because the engravings might be wrong. The students got bored. He wrote a letter to the Columbia trustees saying, I brought all these books back from Britain to teach in, but it's just not good enough. And it doesn't teach us about our native species because, of course, the books were mainly focused on known European plants. So he began lobbying the trustees of Columbia and then the state of New York for money to found a botanical garden. And we think today of a botanical garden as a beautiful place to spend a day or to attend a wedding, but they do so much more. Even today, they do, very vital environmental education and research. But for Hosack, a botanical garden was truly a research institution. It was a scientific institution. And the United States lacked a public botanical garden, which was, this is the age when most of the medicines known to doctors came from plants. So how could you not have a botanical garden? It's more analogous to our National Institutes of Health than it is to a public park today. So he couldn't get support. People didn't really understand what he was trying to do, or they thought it wasn't a good use of limited funds. So he, after 3 years, he had a kind of incredible moment in the Hamilton household. And it was one of a number of instances where he saved somebody's life using medicinal plants after he came back to the United States. And in this instance, it was the fall of 1797, and the boy he saved was Philip Hamilton. And this seems to have moved him a step closer to going ahead and trying to found a botanical garden so that he could teach medical students how to save lives using medicinal plants and to conduct research. He couldn't get funding, so finally he just went ahead on his own. and created a botanical garden.
What were the particulars of founding the first botanical garden in the United States? Because it sounded like Hosack needed money and plants and staff and research time in his garden and, of course, land to build a research garden. But it doesn't sound like Hosack was this independently wealthy man where he just had land and funds on hand that he could just found this institution by himself. So how did Hosack go about finding all the elements that he needed for this garden so that he could build it?
He began to borrow money. He used some of his own money, but he wasn't wealthy. He was a professor and a young doctor with a new practice. He probably borrowed some money from his father. His father had been helping him with his studies in Britain. There are wonderful receipts at the American Philosophical Society, Hosack's father's account book, and he keeps sending money to Hosack to buy botanical books to bring back from Britain. So he probably borrowed a little bit from his father, and then he began to go into debt, but he used whatever money he could scrape together to buy 20 acres of land at the heart of Manhattan Island. And he began to pay gardeners and laborers. We have his account books for the botanical garden. It's a wonderful big leather-bound journal with stains and smudges, and it's an account book and plant list. It's up at the New York Academy of Medicine in Manhattan. And so we can see what he was paying his laborers for, blowing up the rocks to lay out the fields of grain, blowing up the Manhattan schist with dynamite, and bringing in loads of manure to improve the land, piles of bricks to build some of the outbuildings. He eventually built an extraordinary conservatory. It was a 200-foot glass house, and there was probably only one other like it in the United States at the time. And it seems to have been modeled on the 18th century glass house at the Royal Botanic Garden of Edinburgh, where Hosack studied. It's almost identical in structure, and Hosack even put a small pond for aquatic plants in front of it, just like the one at Edinburgh. I mean, the expenses were tremendous for this garden, and they went on and on. It took him a decade before he persuaded the state of New York that this was a worthy investment. And sometimes that happens with pioneers and entrepreneurs. They have to show other people what they're trying to do before people come to their senses and say, yes, this is important. It's an important American institution and it deserves funding. And Hosack did that over the course of a decade, spending over $1 million in today's dollars on it out of his own pocket and by borrowing.
And what was some of the evidence that Hosack used to prove that his botanical garden was a worthwhile project and one that the state of New York should be interested in supporting and funding?
Well, he was doing both medicinal research and agricultural research. He was collecting these plants from, sounds crazy, but from the fields of Manhattan and the beaches of New Jersey and the farms of Brooklyn, and collecting plants, native species. And he even collected plants, in the ditches along Broadway, and bringing these native species to the garden and then conducting chemical research to put them next to exotic species and see if there were similar chemical reactions. And that was when you took the leaves of two comparable plants or plants you hoped were comparable and conducted a chemical experiment on them by mixing them with certain other chemicals to see, do they have the same kind of reaction? And that was meant to be a proxy for their medicinal effect. And this was all very rudimentary by today's standards. But the hope was that plants that had similar chemical properties would have similar medicinal properties. And of course, you wanted to try to find that out first through chemical experiments rather than just trying it on patients or yourself directly. So he was sort of very gradually moving knowledge forward about American species. He was also growing in his conservatory where he could grow plants that otherwise wouldn't grow in the New York climate. He was starting to grow medicinal plants that couldn't survive outdoors. And I found a wonderful newspaper ad for Coney Island. When the Coney Island Hotel was first built, the beach at Coney Island was first being advertised as a kind of healthful outing from New York City. This is in the 1840s. It was advertised as being as healthful as the medicines to be had at Hosack's former botanical garden. So it did take on an identity for New Yorkers as a place that was a source for medicinal remedies that were useful to the whole city. That was one reason the state of New York began to be interested. The other was that particularly the various governors became very interested in Hosack's agricultural experiments. He was growing. He had 20 acres. So imagine where 30 Rock sits now was fields of grain, barley, sunflowers, cotton. Hosack wrote to Jefferson and told Jefferson in 1806 that he was successfully growing cotton on Manhattan Island and that he hoped to lessen the dependence of the North on the South and the United States on the West Indies. And I think the state of New York legislators were very interested in Hosack's agricultural experiments.
Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned that in 1811, the state of New York did pass legislation to purchase the botanical garden from Hosack. And I wonder, was Hosack really keen to sell his garden to the state? Because it really seems like he'd invested a lot of time, money, and energy into creating this garden, and like he really loved it.
He always wanted it to be a public institution. And when I first realized he sold it to the state, when I first started doing the research, I thought, oh no, he was bankrupt and he had to get rid of the garden. But I came to realize that his goal all along had been to create a public institution. And there wasn't a great set of models for this. Now we're very used to, you create a 501c3. We have a kind of clear way to create charitable institutions today. This was an era when the organizational models were still being worked out for a charitable or scientific institution. And Hosack's garden really fell between organizational stools in a way, because it wasn't a member-serving society. Like the literary society, you could pay dues and it had a club feel, and you all gathered and you discussed literary works. Or same with the Museum of Fine Arts. You paid in dues and you got to see the artwork. Why would anyone in the early republic go pay dues to go see plants when the benefit of the plants was going to be broader and medicinal rather than simply the refinement of the members, say if the botanical garden had members? So that model didn't work for Hosack. And the other organizational model that didn't work was the straight up charity where, if it were a hospital or a poorhouse, the wealthier New Yorkers would pay to support this charitable institution, because the beneficiaries of a botanical garden, the most immediate ones were the medical students who were being trained there. But the broader ones, it was far too diffuse because it was sort of the improvement of the general health. So Hosack had an organizational dilemma when he was founding this organization. And I think that's one of the reasons he had to found it on his own and bring it to fruition and glory and then sell it to the state. He wanted to found a public institution, but the mission of that organization didn't fit either model, and certainly not the public charity. So he brought it to fruition. And then after a decade of ongoing lobbying, he was constantly going to Albany and constantly working behind the scenes with his friends who were across the political spectrum, his supporters in the state legislature. He was trying for the whole decade to do this, and he only accomplished it after the garden was sort of visibly productive to people who couldn't see what a garden was before that. So he achieved his goal in 1811, which was that the state of New York passed an act agreeing to purchase the garden and rename it the State Botanic Garden. Now, it was called the Act for Promoting Medical Science in the state of New York. Some people said that it should be called the Act for the Relief of Dr. Hosack, because a lot of people clearly thought that he really was selling it simply because he was bankrupt. But he had always wanted to be a public institution. So I see it not as handing it off, but of realizing his ultimate dream.
Hosack's botanical garden sounds like it was an interesting place because it wasn't only a place that yielded scientific and agricultural knowledge, but also an institution that provided lessons for the early republic about how to set up philanthropic and state-run organizations.
Yeah, I think that was one of Hosack's great legacies. And I think it's one of the reasons he's not very well known today. We don't tend to celebrate people who do things like teach us how to found organizations. I think it's incredibly important and vital to the livability of our cities, both then and now, and to the sort of fabric of the nation. But what Hosack was doing was kind of unglamorous in that regard. It was helping develop new organizational models. And then also, through all of his organizing zeal, he loved, writing bylaws and hosting annual meetings, which not everybody loves, but he was teaching his fellow citizens and then the next generations how to create and sustain organizations, which is, of course, the only way we get anything done in our society. It's just that we're not that great at celebrating it. And that's one reason I've been very excited to talk about Hosack, both in the pages of American Eden, but also to audiences across the country, because I've ended up meeting all of those contemporary counterparts to Hosack because I'm speaking at many museums and historical societies and botanical gardens. And I'm meeting those men and women today who are doing that kind of sometimes unglamorous work that I think is so vital.
Victoria, when you think of everything you've seen, all the different records you found scattered throughout the United States and Europe, as well as the larger pictures of early American history and European history, what do you think are the biggest lessons that we can take from Hosack's public life and all his work to create philanthropic institutions?
So for the early republic, looking at Hosack's life, I think it shows us what an organizational project it was. As an organizational sociologist, I think I had a slightly different eye to cast on this time period. I wasn't coming to this as a political historian, for example, or a cultural historian. I was really interested in these organizational models, their invention and refinement, and the contestation over them. And I hope that that makes a contribution to our understanding of that post-revolutionary generation. What I also think we get from looking through Hosack's eyes is a different view of some of these very familiar figures we are all so interested in, people like Hamilton and Burr, of course, but also some of the lesser known figures. Hosack was interacting with them as a doctor in their homes. So we get some new views of their home life. For example, I noticed in Hosack's medical writings that he was writing about ways that he intervened in childbirth emergencies. He was writing an article about this, and he mentioned in passing that he had saved the life of Nathaniel Pendleton's week-old infant son. Now, Nathaniel Pendleton went on to be one of the key players in the Hamilton-Burr duel. He was Hamilton's second. And so I realized that when Hosack stepped into the boat at the edge of the Hudson with Hamilton and Pendleton, Hosack had saved the life of the sons of both men he was in the boat with. That's a different kind of side of these men and their relationship. And that happened over and over in my research for American Eden, and discovering that Aaron Burr was a passionate plantsman. That was a real surprise to me. This man we think of as a political animal and possibly for some a villain and a libertine. And, and here he is absolutely crazy about botany and horticulture and plant science in a way that I don't think people have really noticed. And we wouldn't have noticed if we weren't looking through the eyes of Burr's friend, the botanist Hosack. And I think it's sort of looking at a slightly different angle through different eyes on the early republic, both because my background is an organizational sociologist, but also because Hosack had a different kind of relationship to these people, not a political relationship, but a medical and scientific relationship.
Speaking of the different personal sides of Hamilton and Burr, we have been talking a lot about Hosack's important professional life, but we haven't really talked about his personal life. So could you tell us about the personal life of David Hosack and how he came to have relationships with men like Hamilton and Burr?
This was the most difficult part of my research. He did not leave a lot of writing about this. I had to really glean it from the letters between his second wife, Mary Hosack, and her sister in Philadelphia. And she wrote a bit about their home life. His first wife had died in childbirth, and he had lost his first two infants, his children with his first wife. So he was left completely alone as a fairly young man. He was still in his 20s. And this is when he turned to obstetrics as his main focus and became well known as one of the premier obstetricians in the United States, and wrote absolutely devastatingly, movingly about being an obstetrician. And it was through his emotion in his medical writing and his teaching, his lectures about childbirth and what it was like to be in the room and be the doctor and have to be authoritative in that room. The way he wrote about that was so emotional compared to his other medical writings. In all, he lost 5 of his 11 children, 4 of them as infants, and lost 1 wife in childbirth and 1 later after a long illness. We don't know what the illness was. But I had to kind of triangulate and read his private emotions through some of his public writings, and then through his wife's letters to her sister in Philadelphia about how much she loved New York City and her life with her family there. She was a native of Philadelphia, and her sister ribbed her that she had fallen so in love with New York and her family life there that she was in danger of forgetting that she was actually from Philadelphia. So like a lot of adopted New Yorkers, she came to love the city very much. Hosack was, I don't know if he had letters that haven't survived, or he simply wasn't writing those kind of personal letters. And of course, that's very frustrating as a biographer and hard to work around. But I tried to bring the man off the page through these other techniques, even though I refused to speculate in my writing. That I really tried to stick to the historical record very rigorously and not speculate about his emotions, but only to talk about people's emotions when I really felt on firm ground.
It sounds like Hosack's personal life really informed a lot of his professional interests. I mean, earlier you mentioned that aside from the botanical garden, his other chief passion in life was his obstetrics hospital. And it sounds like his personal life really informed his interest in obstetrics.
Doctors were called into the homes of the wealthy. And even in that situation, when a wealthy woman was giving birth, there was such a potential for infection and mortality for both baby and mother. Imagine, and this is what Hosack imagined, imagine what was happening in the shacks around the city, in the almshouse. And Hosack was an attending physician at the prison, at the almshouse, and in the hospital. And the hospital, of course, was also not for the wealthy. It was, the wealthy were always trying to bring the doctor home. And so he had seen such horrors in the city in childbirth that he founded, it was called the Lying In Hospital, and it was meant to serve the poorer women of the city who didn't have even the advantages that the wealthy women had.
Now, throughout our conversation, Victoria, I have noticed that you've been engaging in some name dropping. I mean, we've heard the names DeWitt Clinton, Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr. How exactly did David Hosack go about befriending all of these different movers and shakers of New York, and in some cases, movers and shakers of the early United States?
Hosack was an amazingly gregarious man, and he had so many friends and acquaintances, in part because of his medical practice. But it's interesting, he was a teetotaler, but he loved throwing parties. And, the liquor flowed at his parties. He was, especially after he lost his second wife and he married for a third time, his third wife was quite wealthy, and they had a very happy, big household and several houses. And he began to throw with her these famous Saturday night parties that all the, visiting dukes would go to, and artists, and, the cream of New York City was going to these parties. And he had this reputation for being very talented at being friends with people across the political spectrum. And I think some of that was the prudent nature of a doctor who doesn't want to only treat Democratic or Republicans, right? That's not very lucrative to treat just one political party. But it was much bigger than that. It was a matter of principle with Hosack. He was so nerdy and passionate about science that he didn't want politics to get in the way of pursuing his civic causes, his scientific interests, and his institution building. I think one of the most telling items I found in his letters was that he was nominating DeWitt Clinton, his dear friend of decades, to be a fellow of the American Philosophical Society. Hosack was already a member himself. And so he's writing to the secretary and he says, "I wish you would make DeWitt Clinton a member. I don't agree with his politics, but he is a man of science." And Hosack wrote, "Science does not admit of party politics." He had this sense that science trumped all, and you should not get embroiled in any kind of disagreements politically, because that would prevent scientific progress. It was a very Enlightenment view, and he had studied at the heart of the Scottish Enlightenment. And it told me so much about what drove him as a friend, as an American. He had this obsession with improving the nation. And I found a later quote, wonderful later quote in a letter he was writing to his protege, a younger doctor. This younger doctor was writing a profile of Hosack. And in a letter to Hosack, the younger doctor asked him about this episode in which Hosack had been asked by friends late in life, when he was just retiring, asked him to run for political office. And Hosack declined. I'm paraphrasing, but he said, if a party could be formed that pursued the interests dearest to my heart, the natural environment, the improvement of the nation, and education, to that party I could swear my allegiance. And this is a quote. He talks about the, quote, existing dissensions, which sounds so contemporary to me. He says, in this age of existing dissensions, I prefer to cultivate my vine and fig tree. And he quotes Washington's letter to Lafayette, which had recently been published. This is in the 1820s, and this letter had recently appeared in the local papers. And I was trying to figure out, why would Hosack quote this in the 1820s? And then I discovered that it had just been republished in papers near where Hosack was living at the time in upstate New York. And he quoted this, and he said, in this age, I have to restrain myself from politics. But he always prioritized what he saw as the greater good of the nation. And of course, today we can argue whether, stepping back from politics is actually the way to improve the nation. But for Hosack, it would have prevented his bringing people together in a bipartisan way in the pursuit of American science.
So this raises an interesting question for us, which is, how did a man who tried really hard to avoid partisan politics and any sort of political confrontation end up serving as the attending physician to the Hamilton and Burr duel? Because if you want to talk about political confrontation, you can't really get much more political and confrontational than the Hamilton and Burr duel.
It's absolutely classic Hosack to do this. So Hosack was the friend and family physician by 1804, when the duel was fought. He was the friend and family physician to both the Hamilton family and to Burr and Burr's daughter, Theodosia. So he was the logical choice to be the attending physician at the duel. It's kind of amazing to us when I try to think about what Hosack must have been feeling when he stood there waiting for the sound of pistol fire. Now, he was left on the beach below the dueling ground, so he wouldn't be an eyewitness in the case of legal proceedings. He didn't actually go up to the dueling ground, according to his own testimony. He stayed on the beach at the edge of the Hudson, and his friends met on a dueling ground, and he waited for the sound of pistol fire, not knowing which of his friends he would find wounded or dead, which of his friends he would be called to minister to. And so when he heard the pistol fire and raced up to the ledge where the duel was fought, he didn't know what he was going to see. And what he saw, of course, was Hamilton lying on the ground, half cradled in Pendleton's arms. And it was Hosack and Pendleton who got Hamilton half dead, but still breathing, across the Hudson to New York City.
So even in this event, Hosack tried to stay impartial and neutral by not rooting for either Hamilton or Burr and staying on the beach until the actual event was over.
Yes. And what was even more astonishing to me, he was devastated by Hamilton's death. There was nothing he could do. He tried so hard to keep Hamilton alive. He was with Hamilton when he died the next day, along with family and friends at the deathbed. But he agreed to conduct the autopsy on Hamilton, which I find absolutely searing to imagine Hosack cutting open his friend to find the path of the bullet. And after he performed that task and testified in the inquest, one might think he would reject and revile Aaron Burr. Even if Hosack was politically neutral, one friend had killed another friend. And that is not at all what happened. Hosack stayed close with Burr for the rest of their lives. And when I read that, it took me a while to understand that. And then I realized that for Hosack, it really was a political event rather than a personal event. And political in the sense that Joanne Freeman has shown us about duels as affairs of political honor and not simply personal vendetta. And Hosack understood that fundamentally, and it permitted him to stay close with his other friend for the rest of their lives. And Hosack was so close to Burr that one of Hosack's younger brothers was traveling in Europe with Burr when he went into exile several years later after his other political scandal out west. Hosack's younger brother, William, went as Burr's traveling companion, and Hosack was one of the people to whom Burr wrote from time to time asking if the coast was clear for him to come home. And Hosack was the person Burr chose to take care of Theodosia, who was now a young woman, but deathly ill with probably a prolapsed uterus and a blood infection. She was very, very ill, and she was in New York City in Hosack's care. And Burr even wrote to Hosack about the Elgin Botanic Garden while he was in Europe, sent him plans for the Elgin Botanic Garden. So they stayed very close. And in an amazing twist of sort of tidying up of fate, it was Hosack's son, Alexander, who was a doctor as well, who took care of Burr in Burr's last illness, Hosack having died 9 months earlier.
Speaking of Hosack's death, we learned from your book, American Eden, that David Hosack died of a stroke in 1835. And as we consider Hosack's life and all his major accomplishments, what do you think his lasting legacy is? And is there anything about that legacy that has really impacted our own time?
It's hard to get your brain around the fact that he was so famous when he died. He suffered a stroke and he lay in a coma for several days. And during this period, bulletins were published or rushed to newspapers from New Hampshire to South Carolina saying Dr. Hosack has fallen ill and he lies near death. This is how famous he was. And of course, those bulletins got there after he had died. He died in New York in December 1835. And people published articles in local papers saying he has touched thousands of lives and his death has left a blank in the social and scientific world. Now, today, most people don't know his name. So what is his legacy if he could be one of the most famous Americans who wasn't a politician, one of the most famous Americans of his day, and yet be almost completely forgotten today? I think his most visible legacy is in American botany. He founded the first public botanical garden in the United States, and that garden disappeared in the second decade of the 19th century as New York bought the land, then gave it to Columbia College, and Columbia ended up holding it for developers and leasing it, and then leasing it for Rockefeller Center. So Hosack's great legacy kind of vanished physically, and I think that is one reason he's forgotten today. But his training of American botanists, he trained the first generation of professional American botanists. Before him, it was polymaths and nurserymen. And he trained a generation of young men who became the first professional American botanists. And they went on eventually to train the students who established botanical gardens across the United States. And today there are botanical gardens in every one of the 50 states in the District of Columbia. And although Hosack's original garden is gone, I think of him as being present in a way in all of those gardens in all 50 states. That's one major legacy. Another is the one we talked about earlier, which is quite diffuse, but I think so fundamentally important. And that is that he taught his fellow citizens how to build civic institutions. So not just his legacy in founding civic institutions, including founding what became the Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons, today's Columbia Medical School. He co-founded the New York Historical Society, which is still in existence today. But in addition to the actual concrete organizations that he founded that still exist, he taught the next generations how to conduct scientific research when they had their own, so that when their questions moved forward, they could in turn teach the next generation these methods he had learned at the heart of the Scottish Enlightenment. And he taught them how to build institutions, to build organizations and nurture them and fundraise and keep them alive. And that's an extraordinary accomplishment that had ripple effects throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. And we rarely celebrate those kinds of accomplishments because they're so diffuse. And that's why I'm so excited to celebrate David Hosack and people like him today.
We should jump into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Now, germ theory is the theory that states that the presence and actions of microorganisms within the human body are the actual cause of many diseases. And germ theory came of age after David Hosack's death during the mid-19th century. So, Victoria, in your opinion, what might have happened if David Hosack had been aware of germ theory during his lifetime? How do you think the knowledge of this theory would have impacted his innovations and experiments with the medicinal uses of plants?
It would have had a huge impact. He was focused heavily on experimenting with plants that had properties of purging and sweating because he was working at the tail end of the humoral approach to the body, the idea that the body needed to be kept in balance with its environment. And so if a body was fevered, you might try to sweat it to either let out the impurities or break the fever, or you might bloodlet. Hosack tried not to engage in bloodletting because he found it, very violent intervention, and he tried to use gentler and more specific treatments. But bloodletting also fit into this humoral approach where you would try to release excess blood. It was thought that a fevered body might be suffering from excess blood. And mercury was another one that people used. Hosack tried not to use it. He tried to use gentle plants instead, but mercury again was one medicine that people turned to because it purged the body of all kinds of solids and fluids at once. And that was thought maybe to help regulate the body's relation to its environment. And what would have happened if Hosack had been working in an age when people knew about germ theory, he would have focused, I think, less on those purging and sweating effects of medicinal plants and more on the experimenting on which plants had antimicrobial properties. So today, there's a kind of renaissance of research among biologists who are turning back to the plant world to try to discover plants with antibiotic properties, because of course we've become reliant on these synthetic antibiotics that we're developing resistance to, and we're creating superbugs with resistance. And he would have been thrilled to see that researchers, for example, there's a wonderful biology lab at Emory run by a pioneering botanist named Cassandra Quave, and she is identifying medicinal plants with antimicrobial properties. And that is an innovation that, had Hosack known about germ theory, he would have been focusing, I think, on those kinds of plants. For example, there's something called elm leaf blackberry, Rubus ulnifolius, that has antimicrobial properties. And he would have been going crazy researching those, and I think finding some really exciting interventions.
So now that you've researched the life of David Hosack, do you have a new research project that you're working on?
Well, I do have a new book idea kind of percolating. Like a lot of writers, I'm loath to talk about it too much so it doesn't diffuse from my own head and imagination. But I will say that I'm crazy about the early republic and its love of botany, and I love writing about landscapes and trying to transport contemporary readers back into lost landscapes. And my new book will be following a thread that I discovered while I was working on American Eden and spinning that out into its own book.
And if we have more questions about the life and work of David Hosack, or perhaps even botany in the early republic, how can we get in contact with you?
I have a website called AmericanEden.org that was designed by a wonderful landscape visualization expert named Markley Boyer, who some people will know from the work he did on the book Mannahatta, which gave us an image of what Manhattan looked like when Henry Hudson arrived. That book was written by Dr. Eric Sanderson. And Markley Boyer designed a website that has some visuals from the book, as well as some of Hosack's plant lists, some of the medicinal uses, and some of the backstory of the places I did research and the kinds of documents I used. and has some links to some original sources if people are interested. So that's AmericanEden.org.
Victoria Johnson, thank you for introducing us to the life and work of Dr. David Hosack.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure.
When Victoria began her research, she thought she was going to research and write an organizational history of the first botanical garden in the United States. But as we know, that's not the actual project she undertook. Instead, her work, American Eden, reveals the life of Dr. David Hosack, the founder of that first botanical garden in the United States. Now, David Hosack came of age in New York City during the American Revolution, and the British occupation of New York seems to be what inspired him to become a doctor. So Hosack studied medicine at Columbia University and in Philadelphia with Benjamin Rush. He then sought advanced medical training abroad at the University of Edinburgh and in London, where he learned more about the finer points of anatomy and the medicinal properties of plants. Hosack then brought his knowledge home to New York City, where he opened a medical practice, taught medicine at Columbia, and became one of the young United States' leading philanthropists. Now, according to Victoria, Hosack helped found or co-found more than a dozen of New York City's important institutions. Its first art museum, the New York Historical Society, its first obstetrics hospital, and the first botanical garden in the nation. It was with the help of this botanical garden that Hosack studied and proved to Americans the medicinal value of plants, which, when you think about it, was extremely important work in an age where most medicines derive from plants. Further, Hosack's botany work was specific. It showed Americans the medicinal properties of plants native to American soils. Plus, the garden helped him train and educate the next generation of American doctors. But the value of Hosack's botanical garden didn't just work to advance American medicine. It also created a blueprint for how Americans might create and sustain philanthropic institutions. Institutions that are meant to improve American knowledge and American society. Of course, as Victoria told us, United States history doesn't tend to celebrate people who teach us how to found organizations, which is why David Hosack is most remembered as the attending physician at the Hamilton bird duel in 1804. Now, of all the different lessons we can learn from David Hosack's life, I think one of the most intriguing lessons is how Hosack tried to stay above the fray of divisive party politics, which must have been a real challenge for Hosack when you think about it, because the 1790s and early 1800s were very partisan times. And yet, Hosack didn't let politics stand in the way of his acting for the public good or in partnering with people who could help bring his institutions into being. The key for Hosack really seemed to be his focus on how he could best serve the public good. And that's why I happen to think that it's this aspect of his life that's most intriguing. Look for more information about Victoria, her book, American Eden, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/273. Did you enjoy today's episode? If so, I'd appreciate it if you would please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Kayla Pittman, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, did David Hosack help establish a public institution that surprised you? I'd love to hear what you think. So please send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.